If you have IBS, irritable bowel syndrome, and you have went to the doctors, you've done all the tests, and you still found no physical or structural reason for it, then this video is for you. This is your first time here. My name is Andreas, and I'm the founder of mindbodyconnection.org. We help high-performing professionals get out of chronic pain and irritable bowel syndrome by using clinical hypnotherapy and neural circuit retraining. Before we get into today's topic, a quick caveat. You see, our understanding of IBS is still developing, and IBS is what we call a heterogeneous condition, meaning that its causes, symptoms, and treatments vary widely. So therefore, I'm not trying to make any absolute statements in this video. However, I do want to highlight what I think is one of the most important mechanisms that drives the symptoms of IBS and that can inform how we can treat it successfully. So let's get right into it. Between 3 to 11% of people struggle with IBS, depending on how you define it and how you measure it. And that's a lot of people. And the symptoms are usually abdominal pain with either diarrhea, constipation, or both. And what is interesting about irritable bowel syndrome is that it's a so-called functional disease, meaning that in most cases, there are no signs of physical damage to the intestines. Nothing seems to be physically wrong. But the symptoms are very real and very severe in a lot of cases. This has a large negative impact on quality of life. Some people struggle to get out of the house, or they need to be aware of where the bathrooms are wherever they go, or they just have too much pain. But if there's no actual damage to the body, how is it possible that the symptoms can be so real and so severe? You know, researchers have been trying to figure out an answer to this problem for decades now, and I think we are closing in on an answer, at least a part of the answer. So in 1973, researchers did an experiment where they inserted a kind of balloon into the intestines of people with IBS and a control group consisting of people without IBS. And then they measured, or rather asked about their pain levels as they inflated the balloons. So what they found was that when the balloon was inflated to 60 milliliters of volume, 6% of the people without IBS said that they experienced some kind of pain. But what is interesting is that 55% of the people with IBS said that they experienced pain at that level, which suggests that the people with IBS, they are more sensitive to the sensations that's going on in their intestines. The people with IBS in that study was actually almost 10 times more likely than the people without IBS to experience pain at any given level of pressure in the balloon. Now, remember, if the intestines had shown any signs of damage, that would make sense. Increased pressure from the balloon onto damaged tissue would equal more pain. That would make sense, but that's not the case. There was no signs of damage to the intestines, yet they still felt more pain. So how is that possible, that some people experience more pain than others? And in 1990, a review came out that took insights from this balloon experiment and developed the idea further. And they formulated an idea that IBS and other functional bowel-related symptoms and conditions were caused by more sensitivity to the signals coming from the gut and to the brain. And this laid the foundation for how we think about IBS and other conditions today, where we have a more advanced understanding now, but this laid the groundwork. And this phenomenon, called visceral hypersensitivity, is very, very common in people with IBS. And it simply means what we just discussed, that they are more sensitive to the sensations that's going on in their guts. So from that idea of visceral hypersensitivity, we can intuit that there's more to IBS than just simply something wrong in the gut. It indicates that there's something going on in the communication between the brain and the gut, called the gut-brain axis. This starts to make more sense when you consider a meta-analysis that came out in 2011. And they looked at brain activity in people who experienced rectal distension. And that's a similar idea that it's pressure is being applied inside of the intestines. And they measure the brains of people who experience that. And they found that people with IBS show much greater activation in the parts of the brain that has to do with emotional arousal, meaning stress or more emotions going on related to their bowel movements. So now we know that people with IBS seem to have a greater sensitivity to the sensations in their guts, but we also know that they have greater activation of emotions related to what's going on in their bowels. This starts to make sense when you consider that the areas in the brain that process physical pain are very, very much interconnected with the brain areas that process emotional pain. And this is where everything starts to tie together to form a complete picture of what is going on here. Another thing you need to know that adds to this dynamic is how the autonomic nervous system works, meaning the fight or flight response and the opposite, the rest and digest. So what happens when you have when you experience stress or you have a lot of emotional arousal or emotional activation, kind of like what we just discussed, that people with IBS seem to have more of related to what's going on inside of their guts. Stressors like that, they put the body into fight or flight mode. And the purpose of that is to get the body ready for action. So to get ready for action, blood and nutrients and resources need to go out of the internal organs, out of the digestive system, and into the large muscle groups to get ready. So blood pressure will go up, the pulse will go up, and now you're ready to act. But the problem is that when all those resources, those nutrients, go out of the digestive system, the digestion slows down and can struggle to keep up. And that's why you can get nauseous if you work out on a full stomach, or if you get very anxious, you get nauseous, right? And this is also part of the dynamic, that stress can downregulate how well the digestive system works. And in addition to that, people with IBS are more sensitive to whatever happens. They experience more pain and then probably more fear and more worry and more anxiety. And then you have a cycle going. And we call this the pain-fear cycle, where stress about symptoms create more symptoms. And in addition to that, the brain can learn that response over time and actually create pain and create symptoms like that because of a prolonged stress response coming from a dysregulated nervous system and an overly sensitized brain. So where does this nervous system dysregulation come in? That can happen for a multitude of reasons, but the data seems to suggest that this usually comes from very challenging or traumatic and emotionally intense experiences, especially in childhood, but also as an adult. There was one study in 1996 where the researchers interviewed their female IBS patients, and they found that 66.5% of the women they interviewed with IBS had suffered some kind of abuse. And in later years, researchers have kept exploring this to see if there is an actual connection between what we call adverse childhood events, meaning traumatic or emotionally intense, challenging events in childhood, and chronic pain, chronic disease, etc. And the data is pretty clear. There's a significant correlation between challenging events and chronic disease, unfortunately. So when you're exposed to physical or emotional trauma, and especially early on in life, that can lead your nervous system to become overly sensitized, meaning that your brain and nervous system will be more sensitive to stress and to threats and to danger. And it can also lead you to be more sensitized to internal sensations, like what happens in IBS. And the result can be that when you experience regular processes, like digesting food, liquids, and the gas that comes along with the digestive process, that can actually lead to pain. And since the nervous system is sensitized to stress, that can also cause the fight or flight response to be more chronically activated, meaning that you never go back into that rest and digest response, where the nutrients and resources go back into the digestive system. So now you can kind of see how this all works together. So the brain is more sensitive to sensations that create pain, and you're more sensitive to danger signals. So when you experience that pain, more stress and more worry and more fear shows up. And additionally, you have that fight or flight response that makes the digestive system work in a poorer way. And all of this comes together to create a lot of the IBS symptoms that people experience. So to be perfectly clear, I'm not saying that everyone with IBS has experienced trauma. That's not what I'm saying. I'm also not saying that there's never any physical, biological aspect to IBS. I'm simply providing you a model in which to think about how the brain and gut communicates and how these vicious cycles can show up and perpetuate symptoms over time. And this is sometimes why people can do all the tests, all the interventions. They can go on the low FODMAP diet. They can eliminate anything and everything. They can try everything. But nothing seems to work. And that's because nothing has happened to the relationship between the gut and the brain and how the nervous system interprets its environment. So if you think that your IBS symptoms might come from a dysregulated brain and nervous system, there is a free assessment you can take in the description or by scanning the QR code, and that will help you get an indication as to whether or not your pain might come from the brain and the nervous system. We call this neuroplastic pain or neuroplastic symptoms. A lot of people see great results from hypnotherapy and from neural circuit retraining. And that's exactly what we do at mindbodyconnection.org. We help clients all over the world, fully online, to help them regain that sense of safety in their nervous systems and help them break the cycles that perpetuate their symptoms and their pain. So if you're curious about this, I suggest that you start by taking the assessment to see if it's likely that you have these kinds of neuroplastic symptoms. You can also check out the other videos on this channel, especially the one about neuroplastic pain, which goes way more into depth. And feel free to subscribe to the channel if you would like to see more videos like this. Put your questions in the comments and I'll make sure to get back to you on that. And please enjoy the rest of your day. And I'll see you in the next video.